cold was the first thing Elias noticed when he arrived in the valley, and it was the last thing he felt before the stillness of sleep claimed him each night. It was a sharp, biting cold that lived in the shadows of the tall pines, a permanent resident in the damp earth beneath his boots. He had come here seeking that cold, that silence. He had come here to build a wall. His companion, a German shepherd named Ghost, sat beside the growing foundation, his head cocked. The dog's breath plumed in the crisp morning air, a soft, rhythmic cloud against the gray stone. Ghost was more than a dog. He was an anchor, a living, breathing tether to the present moment. Elias lifted another stone, its weight a familiar and grounding pressure in his gloved hands. The muscles in his back and shoulders coiled, then released, a steady, repetitive motion that kept the whispering thoughts at bay. Each stone was a prayer, each layer of mortar a seal against the past. The people in Havenwood, the small town nestled a few miles down the mountain, thought he was strange. He saw it in their eyes when he went to the general store for supplies, his cart filled with bags of concrete mix, rebar, and little else. They called him the Wall Man. He heard the nickname whispered between aisles, a mix of mockery and unease. "Building a fortress up there," a man with a heavy gut and a flannel shirt had said, not bothering to lower his voice. That was Mr. Henderson, a farmer with land that bordered the national forest where Elias's cabin stood. Elias had not responded. He had simply paid for his things, the quiet woman at the counter, Sarah, avoiding his gaze as she handed him his change. Her caution was different from the others. It felt less like judgment and more like a gentle, worried curiosity. Back at the cabin, the work was everything. The wall was growing, a formidable barrier of local granite, already waist-high and snaking around the small, isolated cabin. It was not a fence. It was a wall, thick and deliberate, with a single, heavy wooden gate planned for the front. "What do you think, boy?" Elias murmured, his voice rough from disuse. Ghost nudged his hand with a cold, wet nose, then looked from Elias to the wall and back again. The dog's amber eyes held a deep, unwavering understanding. He trusted the work. He trusted Elias. That was enough. The cabin itself was old, purchased for a pittance from the estate of a long-dead prospector. It was small, solid, and defensible. That was what the listing had failed to mention, but what Elias had seen immediately. It was set into a natural hollow on the mountainside, with a clear field of view to the south and a sheer rock face to the north. A perfect place to disappear. A perfect place to be still. But the stillness he craved was always just out of reach, chased away by the echoes of a world he had left behind. The sound of a falling branch in the forest could become the sharp crack of rifle fire. The howl of the wind through the pines could twist into the sound of screaming. His hands would clench. His breath would catch in his throat, a cold, hard knot of ice. Then a heavy weight would press against his leg. A wet nose would find its way into his palm. Ghost. The dog would lean into him, a solid, warm presence, until the hammering in Elias's chest slowed to a manageable rhythm. The dog always knew. He was a sentinel against the shadows that lived inside Elias's own mind. The seasons began to turn. Summer's heat gave way to the sharp edge of autumn. The wall grew higher, a gray ribbon against the vibrant reds and yellows of the changing leaves. It was now taller than a man, a serious and imposing structure in the middle of nowhere. The trips to town became less frequent, but the whispers grew louder. The mockery had hardened into suspicion. "What's he hiding up there? Running from something, I'd bet." Elias ignored it. Their words were weightless, abstract. The stones in his hands were real. The ache in his muscles was real. Ghost, whining softly for his dinner, was real. One afternoon, a sheriff's truck rumbled up the winding dirt track to his cabin. Elias was setting a capstone, his focus absolute. Ghost let out a low, guttural growl, not of aggression, but of alert. He stood between Elias and the approaching vehicle, a silent, furry guardian. "Easy, boy," Elias said, placing a hand on the dog's powerful neck. The sheriff, a man named Brody, with a tired face and a weary slump to his shoulders, got out of the truck. He did not approach the wall, but stood by his door, hands resting on his belt. "Afternoon," Brody called out. Elias gave a curt nod, his eyes never leaving the man. "Folks in town are getting a little concerned," the sheriff said, gesturing vaguely at the massive stone structure. "It's my property," Elias replied, his voice flat. "No one's disputing that," Brody said, his tone reasonable. "It's just unusual. People get to talking. You can understand." Elias did not understand. He understood squad formations, fields of fire, and the physics of a collapsing structure. He did not understand the intricate, pointless web of small-town gossip. "I like my privacy," Elias said. It was the simplest explanation, and the only one he was willing to give. Sheriff Brody sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of resignation. "Look, son, I don't care if you build a castle up here, but Henderson's been complaining, says your wall is causing runoff issues onto his lower pasture." It was a lie. The wall was built with proper drainage, culverts set every 20 feet. Elias had spent a week on the drainage alone, ensuring the natural flow of water was undisturbed. "My drainage is sound," Elias stated. The sheriff squinted, looking at the meticulous construction. "Seems so," he admitted. "Just try to keep the peace, all right? Havenwood is a quiet place. We like it that way." Elias watched the truck disappear back down the mountain, dust kicking up in its wake. He turned back to his work, his jaw clenched. A quiet place. He knew there was no such thing. There was only loud and less loud. That night, the dream came back. The cold was different, not the clean, sharp cold of the mountains, but a damp, seeping chill that came from wet concrete and fear. He was in a city, a labyrinth of shattered buildings and skeletal remains of cars. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The sound was a constant, deafening roar. Gunfire, explosions, shouting. He was pressed against a wall, a flimsy barrier of cinder blocks that trembled with every impact. His team was with him, young faces smeared with grime and exhaustion. They were supposed to be safe there. "Hold this position," a voice had screamed. His voice. The wall was supposed to hold. He remembered the sound, a low, grinding rumble, followed by a sharp crack that cut through the chaos. The wall buckled. Dust and debris rained down. He remembered the feeling of weightlessness as the floor gave way, the sudden, violent lurch into darkness. He remembered the heavy silence that followed, a silence filled with the ghosts of his men. Elias woke up with a gasp, his body drenched in a cold sweat. The sheets were twisted around his legs like restraints. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He was suffocating. A heavy pressure settled on his chest. He flinched, a raw cry tearing from his throat, lashing out at the perceived threat. But it was not an enemy. It was Ghost. The big dog had climbed onto the bed and laid his full weight across Elias's torso, pinning him down. He licked at the sweat on Elias's face, whining deep in his throat. The dog's weight was immense, a solid, undeniable reality. The frantic beating of his heart began to slow, sinking with the steady, calm presence of the animal. "I'm okay, boy," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm okay." He buried his face in Ghost's thick fur, inhaling the familiar, earthy scent of his companion. The shadows of the dream receded, pushed back by the unwavering loyalty of the dog. The wall outside was not the wall from the dream. This one would not fail. This one would hold. He had to believe that. The next day, Old Man Hemlock was waiting for him at the base of his track. Hemlock was an ancient fixture of the valley, a man who seemed to be made of the same gnarled wood as the trees he was named after. He rarely came into town, preferring the solitude of his own remote cabin. "Morning," Hemlock rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Elias stopped, wary. Ghost stood at his side, watchful but not hostile. The dog seemed to recognize the old man as part of the mountain itself. "That's a fine wall you're building," Hemlock said, his pale blue eyes surprisingly sharp. They weren't looking at the wall, but at Elias. It serves a purpose, Elias said, his standard, non-committal reply. Everything does, the old man agreed, nodding slowly. But not everyone sees the purpose until they need to. He held out a gnarled hand. In it was a small, tightly sealed glass jar filled with a dark, thick salve. For the dog, Hemlock said. Pine tar and yarrow, good for burns or anything else that ails a good animal. Elias stared at the jar, then at the old man. Why? Hemlock smiled, a crack in his weathered face. The wind's been talking. The squirrels are burying their nuts deep this year. The pines, they're weeping. He gestured to the forest. Something's coming, son. A thirsty season. Best to be ready. Without another word, the old man turned and shuffled back into the trees, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. Elias looked down at the jar in his hand. He had noticed it too, the unnatural dryness in the air, the way the pine needles were turning a sickly shade of brown months ahead of schedule. The stillness in the forest, an expectant hush that felt heavier than simple silence. He put the jar in his pocket and continued his work, a new, sharp urgency driving him. He finished the wall a month later, just as the first snows threatened the high peaks. It was a masterpiece of function, 10 feet high, 2 feet thick, with a reinforced wooden gate that could withstand a battering ram. Inside, he had built a woodshed, stacking it to the roof with seasoned hardwood. He had dug a new, deeper well and installed a hand pump, independent of any power grid. He had stockpiled food, medical supplies, and fuel. The laughter from the town had faded, replaced by a permanent, simmering suspicion. He was no longer just the wall man. He was the crazy doomsday prepper on the mountain. Henderson made sure of that, his stories growing more elaborate with each telling. He's got guns up there, he'd tell the patrons at the town's only diner. Enough for a small army. Building a cult, more like, someone else would add. Elias heard it all on his final supply run before winter truly set in. He stood in the aisle, listening to their voices, feeling the weight of their judgment. It was a heavy, familiar feeling. But this time, it did not penetrate. His wall was finished. He was ready. Let them talk. The winter was harsh, but inside his compound, Elias found a measure of peace. The snow piled high against the outer walls, insulating his small world, muffling the sounds of the outside. He and Ghost fell into a quiet routine, chopping wood, maintaining his tools, patrolling the perimeter of his wall each morning and evening. The training never left him. Vigilance was a part of his DNA now. He read old books by the light of a kerosene lamp, the only sound, the crackle of the fire and the soft snores of the dog at his feet. He was isolated, but he was not lonely. He was haunted, but he was safe. Spring arrived, not with a gentle thaw, but with a sudden, aggressive heat. The snow melted in a matter of days, flooding the creeks and turning the dirt roads into impassable mud. Then the rain stopped, completely. Weeks went by with no precipitation. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the valley floor. The forest, already weakened by what the experts on the radio were now calling a rapid pine blight, grew brittle. The trees that Old Man Hemlock had said were weeping now looked like skeletal matchsticks. The air grew thick with a fine yellow pollen and the scent of parched earth. A fire ban was issued for the entire county. It felt like a futile gesture. The entire valley had become a tinderbox. Elias watched the forest with a growing sense of dread. He knew this kind of heat. He had felt it before in a land of sand and rock, where the air itself seemed to vibrate with menace. He began to clear a wider fire break around his wall, working from dawn until dusk with an axe and a saw. He cut down every tree, cleared every bush, and scraped the ground down to the bare dirt in a 50-foot radius. Ghost followed him, his nose twitching, a low, anxious whine constantly in his throat. The dog could feel it too, the heavy, waiting pressure in the air. Sheriff Brody came by again. This time he looked more than just tired. He looked scared. "We're issuing a pre-evacuation warning," he told Elias, handing him a brightly colored flyer. "Stage 1 means be ready to go at a moment's notice." Elias took the paper but didn't look at it. "It won't be enough," he said, his voice quiet. "What's that?" Brody asked, distracted, his radio crackling with static. "A moment's notice won't be enough time," Elias repeated, looking past the sheriff to the hazy brown sky. "When it comes, it will come faster than a freight train." Brody gave him a weary look, the kind a parent gives a difficult child. "We have a plan, son. The fire department knows what they're doing. We'll get people out." "Are you telling people to clear their property, to create defensible space?" "We're telling them to pack their valuables and get their families ready to move," Brody said, his patience wearing thin. "We don't have the manpower to help everyone clear their land." Elias nodded slowly. They were preparing to run. He had prepared to stand his ground. "You should warn them," Elias said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Tell them the wind will shift. It will come from the north, through the canyon. It will funnel the fire straight towards the town." The sheriff just shook his head. "The weather service says the winds are coming from the southwest." "The weather service is wrong," Elias said. "Look at the high clouds. Look at the way the animals are moving. They're all heading east, away from the canyon." Brody followed his gaze, a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by the stubborn set of his jaw. "I'll stick with the experts," he said, turning back to his truck. "You just be ready to leave when the call comes." Elias watched him go. He knew the call would come too late. He went back inside his cabin and began his final preparations. He filled every container he had with water from the hand pump. He soaked burlap sacks and laid them across the roof of the cabin and the woodshed. He checked the seals on his windows and doors. He pulled out a small, military-grade emergency kit. Inside were fire shelters, breathing masks, and a small oxygen tank, and the small jar of salve from Old Man Hemlock. He placed it on the table, a silent testament to the old man's foresight. The crisis arrived 3 days later. It did not start with a plume of smoke on the horizon. It started with a sound, a low, deep roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sky to the north, which had been a hazy brown, turned a terrifying, pulsing orange. Ghost began to pace frantically inside the cabin, his claws clicking on the wooden floor. Elias went to the gate and looked through the small peephole he had drilled into the wood. What he saw stole the breath from his lungs. It was exactly as he had predicted. A wall of fire, hundreds of feet high, was surging through the canyon, propelled by a furious, hot wind. It was not a fire. It was a firestorm. It moved with impossible speed, consuming everything in its path. The roar grew louder, a physical force that vibrated in his chest. Embers the size of his fist began to rain down, skittering across the cleared ground outside his wall and extinguishing themselves on the bare dirt. Any one of them would have ignited a normal forest floor. His firebreak was holding. He closed the peephole and sealed the gate, dropping a heavy iron bar into place. The air inside his compound grew thick and hot. The light outside turned a hellish, flickering red. The roar was deafening now, the sound of 1,000 freight trains derailing at once. He and Ghost retreated into the cabin. Elias turned on a small, battery-powered radio. The emergency channel was chaos. "Fire has jumped Route 49. I repeat, the fire has jumped the highway. Flames are moving too fast. We're cut off. Henderson's farm, the whole east pasture is gone. Oh God, it's heading for the house." The voice cut out in a burst of static. Henderson, the man who had mocked him, who had called him crazy, his farm was directly in the path of the firestorm. Elias closed his eyes, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. This was not his fight. He had built this sanctuary to escape the world, to escape the responsibility of command, the weight of other people's lives. He had done his duty. He had lost everything. He owed them nothing. Ghost shoved his head under Elias's hand, whining, a high, piercing sound of distress. The dog looked towards the gate, then back at Elias, his eyes pleading. The radio crackled again. It was a woman's voice, thin and terrified. "This is Sarah at the general store. Is anyone there? We're trapped. The fire is at the edge of town. The bridge is out. We can't get across the creek." Sarah, the quiet woman with the worried eyes. Elias's chest tightened. He looked at his wall, his fortress. It was supposed to keep the world out, but now it felt like a cage. He looked at Ghost, who was now standing by the door, his body trembling, looking at him with an intensity that bordered on accusation. The dog knew. He knew that walls could be prisons as much as they could be shelters. "Damn it," Elias whispered. He had a choice. Stay here in the safety he had so meticulously built, or go out there into the inferno, back into the chaos, back into the place where he had failed before. He thought of the wall of cinder blocks, the dust, the silence. He thought of the young faces of his men lost in the rubble. This time was different. This time his wall had held. He was safe, but they were not. "All right, boy," he said, his voice firm. "Let's go to work." The decision, once made, settled over him with a cold, sharp clarity. He moved with a speed and efficiency that was born of years of training. He pulled on a pair of heavy, fire-resistant overalls and thick leather gloves. He strapped the breathing mask over his face and slung the small oxygen tank over his shoulder. He grabbed the emergency kit, a fire axe, and 2 canteens of water. He looked at Ghost. "You stay here," he commanded. "Guard the cabin, understand?" The dog let out a sharp bark, his tail giving a single, determined thump against the floor. Elias opened the cabin door. The heat hit him like a physical blow. The air in his small compound was shimmering, the light a pulsating, angry crimson. The roar of the firestorm was all-encompassing. He unbarred the gate, pulling the heavy wood open just enough to slip through. The world outside was a nightmare. The forest he knew was gone, replaced by a writhing, roaring sea of flame. Trees exploded into torches, sending showers of sparks into the smoke-choked sky. The heat was immense, searing his exposed skin. He pulled his collar up and his hat down, his world narrowing to the small, filtered view of his mask. He had to get to Henderson's farm first. It was the closest, and the most vulnerable. He knew a shortcut, an old game trail that cut across the ridge. It would be dangerous, but it was faster than the road. He ran, his lungs burning with every breath, even with the filtered air. The ground was hot under his boots. The noise was a physical assault, a constant, crushing pressure. He moved on instinct, his body remembering the rhythm of running through a combat zone. Scan, move, scan, assess the threat. The trees were the enemy now, their burning branches reaching for him like skeletal arms. He reached the ridge and looked down. Henderson's farm was an island in a sea of fire. The fields were black and smoldering, but the firestorm had swept past them, heading for the town. The farmhouse and barn, however, were on fire. He could see figures huddled on the porch, trapped by the flames that had engulfed the front steps. He scrambled down the slope, sliding on loose rock and hot ash. As he got closer, he could hear the screams. He burst through the last line of burning trees and into the farmyard. Henderson was there, trying to beat back the flames with a useless garden hose. His wife and 2 small children were huddled behind him, their faces masks of terror. "Henderson!" Elias yelled, his voice muffled by the mask. The man spun around, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "You!" he croaked, his face streaked with soot. "There's no time!" Elias shouted, pointing to the back of the house. "Is there another way out?" "The cellar doors, around back." Elias didn't hesitate. He ran towards the back of the house, the heat from the burning walls blistering his skin. The cellar doors were old, wooden, and on fire. He swung the axe, the sharp blade biting deep into the burning wood. Splinters flew, smoke poured out. 3 swings and the lock shattered. He wrenched the doors open and yelled back to Henderson, "Get them in, now!" Henderson herded his terrified family towards the opening. His wife, her face pale, looked at Elias. "Thank you," she whispered, a sound almost lost in the roar. Elias just nodded, his focus on the burning roof above them. It was groaning, ready to collapse. Once the family was inside the cellar, Henderson paused. He looked from the burning wreck of his home to the strange, masked man who had appeared from the inferno. "Why?" Henderson asked, his voice thick with shame. "After everything I said—" "The roof is coming down," Elias said, his voice cold and sharp. "Get in." He slammed the heavy cellar doors shut just as the farmhouse roof collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a shower of embers and flaming debris into the air. The Hendersons were safe, for now, but the town was still in danger. Elias turned and ran back the way he came, a new target in his mind: the general store. The bridge was out, Sarah had said. He knew the creek. In the summer it was a gentle stream. Now, after the rapid snowmelt, it would be a raging torrent. But he knew a place a quarter-mile upstream, where a massive old-growth pine had fallen across the gorge years ago. The locals considered it too dangerous to cross. Elias considered it a bridge. He moved through the burning woods, his body on autopilot. The smoke was thicker here, a choking, blinding fog. He relied on his internal map of the terrain, counting his paces, feeling the slope of the land beneath his feet. He found the log. It was massive, 3 feet in diameter, its bark blackened, but the heartwood still solid. Below it, the creek churned, a furious brown ribbon of water. The other side was shrouded in smoke. He took a deep breath, the filtered air tasting cool and clean in his burning lungs. He stepped onto the log. It was like walking a tightrope over hell. The heat from the fire rose in waves, the roar of the water below competing with the roar of the flames above. He moved steadily, his eyes fixed on the opposite bank, 1 foot in front of the other. Balance, focus. Do not look down. A burning branch fell from a tree above, crashing into the log just feet in front of him. He stumbled, his arms windmilling for balance. For a heart-stopping second, he teetered on the edge, the churning water calling to him. He threw his weight back, his boots finding purchase on the solid wood. He scrambled past the burning branch and leaped the last few feet to the bank, landing hard in the hot ash. He was across. The town of Havenwood was a scene of chaos and despair. Several buildings were on fire. Panicked residents ran through the smoke-filled streets, their faces etched with fear. The fire department was doing its best, but they were overwhelmed. Their single pumper truck was trying to draw water from a hydrant that had clearly lost pressure. Elias spotted the general store. Flames were licking at the roof, but the main structure was still intact. A small group of people were huddled near the front door, trapped between the fire and the impassable creek. Sarah was among them, trying to comfort a crying child. Sheriff Brody was there too, his face grim, his uniform stained with soot. He saw Elias emerge from the smoke, and his jaw dropped. "How did you get here?" he yelled over the din. "The bridge is gone." "There's another way," Elias shouted back. "Follow me, all of you." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and led them back towards the fallen log. There was hesitation, fear in their eyes as they saw the precarious crossing. "It's the only way," Elias insisted, his voice a raw command. "We have to move now." Sarah was the first to step forward, holding the small child's hand. "I trust him," she said, her voice shaking but firm. One by one, the others followed. Elias went first, then helped them across, one at a time. He held their hands, his grip like iron, his voice a low, steady presence in the chaos. "Don't look down, just look at me, 1 step at a time." He got them all across, the child, Sarah, 2 elderly men and a teenage boy. Sheriff Brody was the last. As the sheriff stepped onto the far bank, he looked back at his town, now being consumed by the flames. "It's all gone," he said, his voice hollow. "Not yet," Elias said, turning towards the mountain. "My cabin. We can make it there." The journey back was a grueling ordeal. The fire was shifting, closing in on them. The air was growing hotter, the smoke thicker. The small group of survivors was exhausted and terrified. Elias pushed them onward, his energy seemingly limitless. He half-carried one of the old men, while Sarah helped the other. They were nearing the final ascent to his property when a massive, burning pine tree crashed down across the trail ahead of them, blocking their path. It fell with a sound like a thunderclap, sending a wave of superheated air and embers over them. They were trapped. Panic began to set in. The teenage boy started to cry. "We're not going to make it," he sobbed. Elias looked at the wall of fire in front of them and the advancing flames behind them. His mind raced, assessing the options. There were none. And then he heard it, a sharp, frantic barking cutting through the roar of the fire. Ghost. The dog appeared on the ridge above them, a dark shape against the crimson sky. He was barking, then running back and forth, disappearing and reappearing. "He's trying to show us something," Sarah said, pointing. Elias understood. "This way," he yelled, changing direction, scrambling up the steep, rocky incline towards where the dog had been. The others followed, their desperation overcoming their exhaustion. Ghost led them to a narrow crevice in the rock face, one that Elias had never noticed before. It was a small animal trail, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It led up and around the fallen, burning tree. They scrambled through the narrow passage, rocks dislodging under their feet, the heat of the fire just inches away. Ghost stayed with them, nudging them forward, barking encouragement. They emerged on the other side, just below the fire break Elias had cleared. They were 50 feet from the wall, safety. As they stumbled across the cleared dirt, a section of the canopy on the edge of the fire break finally gave way. A huge, flaming limb, a widowmaker, broke free and plummeted towards the group. It was heading directly for the small child who had frozen in terror. Sarah screamed. Elias lunged, but he was too far away. He would not make it in time. But Ghost did. The dog moved like a black streak of lightning. He slammed his body into the child, knocking the small boy clear of the impact zone. The flaming branch crashed down where the child had been standing, and a piece of it, a heavy, burning chunk, struck Ghost on his flank and hind leg. The dog yelped, a sharp, piercing cry of agony, and collapsed to the ground, his fur smoldering. Elias felt a cold, sharp dread that eclipsed even the heat of the fire. "Ghost!" He ran to his companion's side, beating out the flames with his gloved hands. The dog was whimpering, trying to get up, but his back leg would not support him. A deep, angry burn covered his side. The others had reached the gate, fumbling with the latch. Sheriff Brody turned back. "Come on, we have to go!" Elias looked from the safety of the gate to the wounded animal at his feet. There was no choice, not for him. He gently scooped the heavy dog into his arms. Ghost cried out in pain, but then licked Elias's chin, his tail giving a weak, pained thump against his chest. The fire axe and the oxygen tank slipped from Elias's shoulder, forgotten. He carried the dog, his most precious cargo, and stumbled the last few yards to the gate as the world behind him was consumed by fire. He collapsed inside the compound, the heavy gate swinging shut, sealing them in. Safe. The firestorm raged for hours. The sound was a physical thing, a constant, violent pressure against the stone walls. The air inside the compound was hot and tasted of smoke, but it was breathable. The small group of survivors huddled in the cabin, their faces pale with shock. Elias ignored them. His entire world was focused on the whimpering animal on his floor. He worked quickly, his hands gentle but sure. He cleaned the burn as best he could with water from his canteen. The skin was red and blistered, the fur singed away. He remembered the jar. He retrieved the salve from Old Man Hemlock and carefully applied the cool, dark paste to the wound. Ghost licked his hand, his breathing shallow. Elias wrapped the wound with clean rags from his medical kit. He sat on the floor, stroking the dog's head, whispering to him, "You're okay, boy. You're a good boy. You're going to be okay." He did not know if it was true. The long night passed in a haze of heat and fear. By dawn, the roar had subsided to a low, crackling hum. The angry red glow outside the cabin's single window had softened to a hazy, gray light. The firestorm had passed. Elias opened the cabin door and stepped out. The world was transformed. Everything beyond his wall was black and gray. A landscape of ash and skeletal, smoldering trees under a smoke-filled sky. It was a scene of absolute devastation. But inside his wall, everything was untouched. The cabin stood solid. The woodshed was full, the ground was clear. His world had survived. The others emerged from the cabin, their faces a mixture of awe and grief as they looked out at their destroyed valley. Sheriff Brody walked to the wall and placed a hand on the cool, solid stone. He looked at it for a long time, then turned to Elias. "You knew," he said, his voice quiet. "You tried to tell me." Elias simply nodded. Henderson appeared then, a ghost from the cellar, his family trailing behind him. He had seen the group from a distance and made his way to the cabin, his face a mask of shame. He walked directly up to Elias, stopping a few feet away. The man who had mocked him, who had spread rumors and turned the town against him, stood there, humbled and broken. Henderson started, his voice cracking. "I don't know what to say." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "We laughed at you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We called you crazy, a fool building a wall in the middle of nowhere." He gestured to the devastation around them, then back to the solid, life-saving structure. "We were the fools," he said, tears streaming down his soot-stained cheeks. "You saved my family. You saved all of us. I'm sorry. God, I am so sorry." Elias looked at the man, seeing not the loud-mouthed farmer from the general store, but just another survivor, stripped bare by tragedy. He gave a slow, tired nod. "It's okay," he said. Sarah came and stood beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. The small child that Ghost had saved ran over and knelt by the dog, who was now resting by the cabin door. The boy gently stroked Ghost's head. "Good dog," he whispered. "Brave dog." Ghost managed a weak thump of his tail. "Why did you do it?" Sarah asked softly, her eyes searching his face. "The wall, all this. You were preparing for something. What did you know?" Elias was silent for a long moment, the sounds of the ruined world settling around him. He looked from the wall to the dog, to the faces of the people he had saved. And for the first time in years, he spoke of the past. "I was a soldier," he began, his voice low and steady. "An engineer. My last tour, we were holding a position in a city, a schoolhouse. We fortified it, but we were stretched thin. We had to rely on existing structures." He paused, the memory sharp and cold in his mind. "We were using a compound wall for cover, cinder block, old. We were told it was secure." His gaze became distant, seeing not the gray ash of the valley, but the gray dust of a fallen city. "It wasn't," he said, his voice flat. "An explosion nearby. The shockwave was enough. The wall just disintegrated. It came down on my men." He swallowed hard, the knot of ice forming in his throat again. "I was the only one who made it out of the rubble. I built this," he said, gesturing to the solid granite wall, "because I swore I would never again trust a wall that I didn't build myself." He looked at them, his eyes holding a deep, ancient pain. "I wasn't building it to keep people out," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was building it to keep them safe. I didn't know who they were going to be." A heavy silence fell over the small group. They finally understood. The wall was not an act of paranoia. It was an act of penance, a memorial of stone and mortar for the men he couldn't save. In the weeks that followed, Elias's compound became the heart of the recovery effort. His well provided clean water, his woodshed provided fuel for cooking, his knowledge provided a blueprint for survival. He was no longer the wall man. He was Elias. He taught them how to clear debris safely, how to check the structural integrity of what remained of their homes. He showed them how to build with stone, how to create defensible spaces, how to respect the power of the natural world they lived in. Henderson became his most dedicated student, his guilt fueling a tireless energy to rebuild not just his farm, but the entire community. Sheriff Brody formally deputized him, making him the head of the town's new search and recovery team. Ghost recovered slowly. His leg would always be stiff, his side scarred, but his spirit was undiminished. He became the town's mascot, a furry, three-legged hero who was showered with affection and treats wherever he went. One evening, months later, Elias stood on top of his wall, looking out over the valley. The first green shoots of new life were beginning to push through the blackened earth. The town was rebuilding, the sound of hammers and saws replacing the roar of the fire. It was a sound of hope, a sound of community. Ghost limped to his side and leaned heavily against him, a familiar, grounding weight. Elias placed a hand on the dog's head, scratching behind his ears. The cold was still there, a permanent part of the mountain's shadow, but it felt different now. It was no longer the sharp, isolating cold of his past. It was just the crisp, clean air of his home. The wall had held, and in doing so, it had not locked the world out. It had brought the world in. He was no longer running from the ghosts of his past. He was building a future, one stone at a time, for the living. He and Ghost stood there together, two sentinels watching the sun set, at peace in the quiet stillness of their valley.